All right, now we're going to address week 4, which is characterized by body folding, which will ultimately lead to the development of the vertebrate body plan. So, highlights for this week. We're going to see the very early stages of organogenesis. Not a lot that you're going to recognize as a fully formed organ, but we're starting these processes. We're going to see development of the tube within a tube body plan, which is the same across all vertebrates, and we'll talk about that. We'll also see neurulation, which is where we develop the early stages of the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. We'll also see the origin of the major brain regions. And then we'll talk about somite differentiation. Now, all of these processes are occurring concurrently. We're going to talk about them separately because it's easier, but they're all happening at the same time. And there is a video in the module which covers body folding, which will really provide a nice perspective on it. It's difficult to show in still photos. All right, so how is it that we get from that flat disc where we finished up in week 3 to something that actually kind of resembles a human? Not a lot, but a little bit. And we do it all in a week. That's body folding. So one of the basic principles at work here is that the tissues are growing at very different rates. The tissues on the outer edges of the embryonic disc and amnion grow fairly quickly, whereas the yolk sac is going to stay largely the same size. And because the yolk sac is anchored ventrally, so that's the stomach side, the embryonic disc, which is growing faster, can only expand up. And as it expands up or dorsally, it then folds around underneath towards the yolk sac. So the cranial, the caudal, and the lateral edges of the disc are going to fold under the dorsal structures. The dorsal structures at this point are the notochord and the somites, which we'll cover later. But that folding underneath will also create the ventral surface of the embryo, or the stomach side. And that's what's shown in this picture here. So this is sort of a large overview of body folding, but we're going to cover each of these processes in detail. Sorry. So in this one, what we're looking at here is sort of an overview of body folding and how it changes the shape of the embryo. If we look sort of here at a blow up of the embryo, we can see the head and tail or cranial and caudal folds and the lateral folds. Now you're looking at these in different planes, okay? So when you can see the head and tail folds, you're looking at the embryo from the side, where you can see both the head and the tail in the same plane. When you're looking at lateral folds, you're looking at a cross section because these are left and right. But ultimately, all of the folds merge together at the future umbilicus or umbilical cord, which occurs at about the site of the yolk sac. So starting with the cranial fold, the cranial fold, again, you can see here, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, on the left, that's the curving of the cranial fold underneath towards the yolk sac. One of the major structures that's formed here is the oropharyngeal membrane, and this one's important because it's going to be the mouth. So this is a fusion of the ectoderm and the endoderm in this region, but it doesn't stay fused forever. Ultimately, it's going to rupture, and that opening will be the mouth. Also in this region, we see the formation of the cardiogenic area, which, again, doesn't look much like a heart, but it will be, and that comes from the folding in this region. And then we have the septum transversum. Now, this one's pretty important. It's a thickened band of mesoderm, and is actually providing early separation between the abdominal and thoracic cavities. Ultimately, it's going to contribute to the formation of the diaphragm and the ventral mesentery. Now, your diaphragm is a muscle that runs across your abdominal cavity, across the top, to separate your chest from your abdomen. So it keeps your lungs away from your intestines. It's also critical for breathing. You can actually have holes in your diaphragm that would allow your abdominal organs to move up into your chest. And as a fetus, that's very bad because it compresses on your lungs and prevents their development. So that's a major birth defect. That diaphragm comes from the septum transversum formed during cranial folding. The ventral mesentery really just describes that tissue that sort of holds your organs in their places. So this is the tissue that sort of keeps your intestines in more or less the right spot along with all your other abdominal organs. Next up, we have the caudal fold, or the rear. So in this case, we're going to form a cloacal membrane similar to the oropharyngeal membrane in that it comes from fused endoderm and ectoderm. It will also rupture, but it will form multiple openings, the anal opening and the urogenital openings. Now, the connecting stalk. This is important. So right now, at this stage of development, the connecting stalk is what's holding the embryo to the developing placenta. It's the connection, as it self-describes. But during this process of folding, as the caudal and cranial folds come down and merge at the connecting stalk, they're pushing it towards the neck of the yolk sac, which is called the vitelline duct, and they are ultimately going to merge and form the future umbilical cord. Finally, we have the allantois, which is sort of a section of endoderm. It's part of the hindgut. It will be within the connecting stalk, and it's something we're going to cover at another time, but it does form at this particular stage. Now again, for the lateral folds, we have to switch perspective. So we're no longer looking at the embryo from the side, we're now sort of taking a cross section because the lateral folds are the left and right sides of the embryo, again folding ventrally and further narrowing the neck of the yolk sac. Now, initially as the lateral folds come down, they initially meet with each other at the cranial and caudal ends, so at the head and at the tail. And once they meet at those ends, they then zip themselves closed in the direction of the umbilical cord. So they're coming from opposite directions, cranial end and caudal end, fusing as they go until they meet at the umbilical cord. Now, as part of this folding process, we do see development of the fetal gut. Again, very early stages. So the basic anatomy of the gut at this stage includes the foregut, which is the head end and includes that oropharyngeal membrane, which will be the mouth. We also have the hindgut, which is the caudal end, again containing the cloacal membrane, which produces the anal and urogenital openings. And the midgut. Now at this stage, the midgut's kind of interesting because it's actually open to the yolk sac, but that will close by the end of embryonic week 6. And so by the end of this folding process, we have an early gut tube, and that actually produces some of that basic body plan that we're trying to get to. So we'll look at that in just a minute. Now, we are also seeing some cavities and membranes forming. We have this intraembryonic column, which is a cavity formed from the somatic mesoderm and the splanchnic mesoderm when the folds are fusing at the stomach, so ventrally. Okay, so remember, the somatic mesoderm is lateral mesoderm plus the ectoderm, and then the splanchnic mesoderm is lateral mesoderm plus the endoderm. And those guys are fusing to form this intraembryonic column or a cavity. We are also seeing the serous membranes folding. So this is going to be the forming. This is going to be the lining of the intraembryonic column. And we've got both somatic and splanchnic mesoderm here as well. The somatic mesoderm will become the lining of the inside of the body wall, whereas the splanchnic mesoderm will contribute to the formation of the visceral or the stomach organs. So we've got a cavity that's formed by this folding process. It's not entirely solid inside. So at this point, we now have our tube within a tube body plan. But what are our tubes? The external tube is the ectoderm, or the future external layer of the skin, the epidermis. The neural tube is actually also derived from this external tube, and we'll get to that in our next lecture. The internal tube is the inner layer of the gut. All right? So if you think of yourself as a paper towel roll with a skinnier paper towel roll on the inside, that's sort of what the embryo is like at this point, where the external roll is the skin and the internal roll is the gut. Everything in between is largely mesoderm, and it's going to become the body cavity. And at this point, we've got an embryo that actually looks a little bit like a baby. Not a lot, but a little bit. So in this picture, the large ball in the lower right is the yolk sac, and it will shrink over time, but right now it makes up a fairly significant portion of the embryo. At the top, that's the early stages of the fetal head and brain, and as it curves down around behind the yolk sac, we curve around towards the tail. And all of the early structures are starting to form, so if you look at it, and we will in later sections, pinpoint most of the locations of the major organs as they're forming, although it is a little difficult to spot them right now. Now, I want to talk about one particular birth defect because it does occur as a result of errors in week 4, although it is a category of birth defects that we're going to cover more later. But here's a sneak peek. So this is gastroschisis. Gastroschisis is a birth defect that occurs when the abdominal organs are actually herniating outside the body, uncovered by a membrane, so exposed to the amniotic fluid. Still functioning, but not where they're supposed to be. This is what's called an abdominal wall defect, which is an extremely descriptive term. There's a hole in the abdominal wall, and as a result, internal organs are on the outside. It can be just the intestines, or it can be more organs, and in some cases, when the hole is quite large, you can actually have the liver out. The larger it is, the harder it will be to fix. Now, how does this happen? Well, what they're showing in the picture here is that as the lateral folds are coming together, if they don't fuse, you can actually end up with the gut tube extending outside of the baby's body. Now, it's a relatively rare birth defect, 1 in 3,000, but not so rare that we don't see a couple of them a year in the prenatal practice that I work at. Largely, this is random, but risk factors include being a very young mother, so we're talking teenage mothers, or smoking actually increases the risk for this as well. However, usually it's a sporadic birth defect, meaning randomness, okay, and we'll talk more about the different kinds of birth defects in another lecture. But the important thing here is this is almost never associated with an underlying syndrome, okay? This is usually an isolated birth defect, a one-off with a low recurrence risk for future pregnancies. What does it mean for a baby? So while we think about this in high-risk pregnancy as a fairly treatable birth defect, there are risks. The bowel can be damaged by the amniotic fluid, and portions of it may need to be removed before the baby can function normally. And about 5% of these babies will die during the pregnancy. That's called an intrauterine fetal demise. That's the IUFD. So while we counsel families that, in fact, the prognosis for this particular birth defect is relatively good, doesn't go along with intellectual disabilities or other kinds of disabilities, about 5% of families will lose their babies before we get to the point where we can fix it. How do we pick it up? So this is quite detectable by ultrasound in the second trimester, and this picture here is showing the arrows pointing at that sort of bulge. So to orient you to this picture, if you're not familiar with ultrasound, on the right-hand side is the baby's head. You're looking at this baby from the side with the head to the left and the tail to the right. And if you follow along the top of the head, you can see the nose, the lips, and then around curves the stomach, and there's this bulge the arrow's pointing at it, and those are the abdominal contents on the outside of the body. Now, you can see this in the first trimester too, but that's tricky because there is actually normal physiologic herniation of the gut outside of the mother's body, or pardon me, the baby's body, in the first trimester. And it is easy to confuse the two if you don't know what you're looking for. So this is primarily diagnosed in the second trimester. Occasionally, we'll pick these babies up as a result of maternal serum AFP screening. So AFP is a chemical that is made both by the placenta and by the baby. It gets into the mother's blood and you can measure it. We've known for a long, long time that it's elevated in babies with spina bifida in mother's blood, largely because there's a hole there, and we'll talk about spina bifida in a bit. But the presence of the hole allows extra AFP to get out. It's the same phenomenon with gastroschisis. Elevated AFP because there's a hole in the baby's abdomen that is allowing extra AFP to get out, and we can measure it in the blood. So sometimes we see these folks actually as a referral for increased risk for spina bifida, and it turns out it's gastroschisis. How are these babies delivered? They have to be delivered in a hospital. You can't do this as a home birth or a birth center birth, and they have to be delivered by an obstetrician, not by a midwife, with NICU ready and on hand. So many community hospitals can't handle these babies, and they have to go to tertiary care centers that can. They need to be delivered, if at all possible, somewhere where they can be treated. But that doesn't necessarily mean you need a C-section. It seems kind of logical, maybe we would, but in reality, the bowel compresses nicely through the vaginal canal, and unless there's some other indication for a C-section, these babies are normally delivered vaginally. Vaginal delivery is certainly safer for the mother, and there's no proven benefit to doing a C-section for the baby. How do we treat these kids? Well, immediately after they're born, they're saran wrapped, and legitimately looks an awful lot like kitchen saran wrap, wrapped around the abdomen to contain the abdominal organs, to keep them moist and to prevent exposure to the environment. After that, the abdominal organs are placed into what's called a silo. So that's what's being shown here. Silo is a long, sort of flexible plastic tube, a little bit like a condom to be honest, and the abdominal organs are pushed into it, and then the tube is sort of inserted into the hole where the opening of the gastroschisis, and then over time the abdominal organs are sort of gently forced back into the abdominal cavity. Now keep in mind, the baby developed throughout the 9 months of pregnancy without these organs on the inside, so the abdominal cavity is in most cases not large enough to contain them. But by gently pushing them in over time, the abdominal cavity can grow and expand around them, and then once they're all inside, you can close it. And generally, these kiddos really do very well after repair. A kid who had a gastroschisis repair, from the outside, you'd never know. This is a little girl who had a repair, and she's doing very well, as most of them do. And in fact, by the time they're off to kindergarten, you'd never know the difference. They don't generally have long-term developmental or other kinds of challenges. One question that parents often ask is, will my baby have a belly button? The answer is usually not at first, because the umbilical opening that normally would form the belly button just isn't present in the normal way. But with corrective surgeries, they can in fact make a belly button, and they look really good. And when you talk to families who are facing these surgeries, sometimes this is just really monumentally important to them, that their kid is going to have a belly button like all the other kids, and knowing that we can do that provides a lot of relief to families. So next up, we're going to talk about neurulation. Again, this is happening at the same time as body folding, and that will be in our next lecture.